Picture this, it's late 1991, and one of the most powerful empires in all of human history just vanishes. Poof. So the Soviet Union collapses, right? And it leaves this huge power vacuum. Now, in the West, people were celebrating the end of the Cold War for sure. But behind the scenes, they were terrified. I mean, you've got this brand new, super fragile Russian state sitting on thousands of nuclear weapons. And on top of that, its own people had no idea where their next meal was coming from. It was a recipe for disaster. And that brings us to the monumental question facing all the top economists at the time. You have this massive country, right? It's rich in all sorts of resources, but it has absolutely no functioning market economy. So what do you do? How do you even start? Well, imagine you get handed one of those IKEA instruction books. You know the ones. But instead of building a bookshelf, the instructions are for building an entire modern capitalist nation from the ground up. Sounds pretty simple, right? A few steps, some pictures. Well, believe it or not, that is almost exactly what happened. See, this instruction book wasn't just a metaphor. It had a real name, the Washington Consensus. It was basically a blueprint, a set of economic policies cooked up by big institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And the whole idea was to take struggling states and turn them into prosperous, stable countries. It was basically a 10-step program for instant economic success. You know, things that sound pretty sensible: control government spending, open up to trade, reform your taxes. But the most important rule for our story, the one that really changed everything, was step 4, privatization. Now, privatization is just a fancy word for selling off stuff the government owns. And on paper, the theory was brilliant. Russia could sell its huge oil fields, its mines, its factories, sell it all to the highest bidder. This would raise a ton of seed capital, money to fund the new government and kickstart the whole economy. But there was a problem, a huge one.
Here's the thing. The new Russian government, and this is so crucial, they refused to sell their most valuable assets to foreigners. National pride, security, all that. So that meant they had to sell to their own people. But who? The average Russian citizen who had just spent 70 years under communism had basically zero money, no cash. And that one single roadblock sent the entire plan spiraling into total chaos. Because without any real buyers, without a legitimate market, this great sell-off became the perfect breeding ground for massive, widespread corruption. And the way it worked was just shockingly simple. The officials who were in charge of this whole privatization thing, they just started handing over entire industries, we're talking oil, gas, minerals, the whole shebang, to their family members, to their friends, and to basically anyone who could offer a big enough bribe. This whole disastrous process got a nickname, the botched privatization. And it had 2 immediate, catastrophic consequences that would go on to define Russia for decades. Okay, so first, since all these massive assets were sold for pennies on the dollar or sometimes just given away, the government never got that seed money it desperately needed. It stayed broke. And second, the country's entire industrial wealth was now in the hands of this tiny, tiny group of incredibly corrupt people. And this is where a new word enters the global vocabulary: oligarchs. And let's be clear, these weren't just rich businessmen. These were guys who got their hands on the core assets of a superpower, literally overnight, all through bribes and connections. So did these new owners reinvest their profits to, build up Russia? Nope, not at all. They immediately started moving all that money out of the country in what's called capital flight. They were buying up mansions in London, yachts in the Med, even English football teams, all while the Russian state and the Russian people got nothing. Now, for years, the government tried to keep this totally broken system afloat by borrowing money from other countries. But by 1998, that whole house of cards was about to come tumbling down. The bill for a decade of pure corruption was finally coming due. And the scale of this failure is just staggering. Through that whole chaotic decade, Russia's entire economic output was cut by more than half. We're talking about an economic depression on a scale you rarely see in modern history. Then, in August 1998, it all just imploded. The government defaulted on its debts. The currency, the ruble, lost 80% of its value basically overnight. It just completely wiped out the savings of ordinary people. The IMF and the World Bank, they see this happening and they rush in with this massive $22 billion emergency bailout. They're trying to stop the bleeding, right?
It was this last-ditch effort to save the whole economy.
But the system was just too broken. Get this, an estimated $5 billion of that international aid money was stolen by connected officials and the oligarchs pretty much the second it arrived in the country. Just gone.
Well, the chaos of the 90s just couldn't last forever. The country was right on the brink. And as the decade finally came to a close, a new, strong leader emerged from the shadows, and he was promising to restore order. So you've got this whole path, right? Collapse, then this botched privatization, then financial default, and it all leads to this one final turning point. At the end of that road, a sick and really unpopular Boris Yeltsin hands over power to his chosen successor, a former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin. So what's Putin's very first act as president? I mean, on his first day in office, December 31st, 1999, he signs a decree. And this decree grants a full presidential pardon to Yeltsin and his family, making sure they would never, ever face charges for all the rampant corruption that happened during those privatization years.
So you see, Putin didn't get rid of the system that was created in the 90s. He just centralized it. He kind of tamed the oligarchs, brought them in line, and he set up this whole new power structure. In this new Russia, power wasn't about keeping voters happy anymore. It was all about appeasing that small group of men who owned the country's most important industries.
So what's the big takeaway from this massive, failed economic experiment? Well, the legacy of the Washington Consensus in Russia really is a stark cautionary tale. I mean, think about it. Russia is the largest country on Earth. It has immense natural resource wealth, and yet today its entire national economic output is about the same size as a single American state, like Texas or Florida. That comparison alone just shows you the incredible scale of the potential that was completely squandered.
Look, the Washington Consensus wasn't necessarily some evil plan. Its fatal flaw was just assuming you could just, airdrop a capitalist blueprint into a country that didn't have the foundations for it. You need things like property rights, the rule of law, and institutions that can actually prevent corruption. Because at the end of the day, the instructions are only as good as the people and the system they're being applied to.
And that leaves us with a pretty provocative final question, right? We've just seen how a good plan can be totally corrupted by people. But what if the problem is bigger than that? What happens when the economic blueprint itself, this one-size-fits-all model we keep trying to apply all over the world, is actually the real source of the problem? Definitely something to think about.